Fascinating story, a fierce showdown escalating as Harvard University in the United States has defied the Trump administration's demand to overhaul its policies on hiring, admissions, and on diversity. The White House accusing elite institutions of fostering anti-Semitism and leftist ideologies has frozen $2.2 billion in multi-year grants to Harvard, threatening nearly $9 billion more. Harvard, backed by faculty lawsuits, has called this a move an assault on academic freedom, vowing not to surrender its independence. As tensions rise, other universities, like Columbia University, face similar cuts, raising alarms over free speech and the future of higher education. Joining us now, Matt Klink, a political consultant and strategic public affairs expert, Cornell William Brooks, a professor at Harvard and former president and CEO of the NAACP, Alex Zedan is the next Republican U.S. Senate candidate, Nish Acharya, former advisor to the Biden administration, and Professor Andrew Latham at Macalester University. Thanks very much. Macalester College, York University, thank you all very much for being with us. Let me come to Cornell Brooks first. What the U.S. government says is that federal investment does not come with the responsibility to uphold civil rights laws, that there is a certain obligation that you have right now. Harvard's statement reinforces the troubling entitlement mindset that is endemic in our nation's most prestigious universities and colleges. How would you reply?
How I reply? First of all, thank you for having me. I would reply thusly. Harvard has been in conversation, in talks with the federal government for many, many weeks. And over that time, the federal government has sent essentially demand letters, which are less about legal compliance than they are about a political ransom. And what I mean by that is the government has not proved, established, or put forward any evidence that Harvard is somehow violating the Constitution or violating any laws with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with respect to anti-Semitism, the government has not made the case that the university has violated any laws, but in fact, the university has responded to the challenge of anti-Semitism with a whole variety of programs and policies. And so it is unfair and unlawful for the government to essentially ask Harvard to violate the First Amendment by doing a couple of things: allowing the government to micromanage its hiring and its firing, staffing, faculty, and students. It is unlawful, as in violating the First Amendment of our Constitution, to have the government conduct a survey of every member of the faculty, the staff, and students, asking them what are their political views. And so my point being here is Harvard can't violate the Constitution in answer to the government's demands. Okay. Those demands are unlawful, unconstitutional, unfair, and unjustifiable, and we can't do that.
Alex Zedan, just in the last hour and a half, Donald Trump has put out a message on his social media platform. He says, and I quote, "Perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired supporting sickness. Remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest." This is an incredibly powerful statement from the President of the United States. Was it necessary, given the fact that Harvard contributes so much to education and fundamental learning that benefits all of us around the world?
Do they? That's an honest question. Do they?
Well, yes.
I'd also like to know if they do it.
I can cite examples, but go ahead and answer the question.
Sure. I think that the American taxpayer does not need to subsidize whatever work Harvard does, some of which is, of course, valuable. Harvard is sitting on a $50+ billion endowment. And if the professor wants to use the ransom analogy, the best thing to do when a ransom demand is made is say you're not going to pay the ransom. You're going to have academic freedom no matter what. Your freedoms and your liberties are granted by God. You are able to practice those. No one ever said that there will be zero consequences for the freedoms that you practice. The American public, the American taxpayer, does not need to subsidize an institution that is sitting on $54 billion. Go tap those big high-powered donors that go to the Harvard University cocktail parties and ask them to write a check if you're so worried about how much money Harvard is taking in. Do that. If you don't want to give it to the president, fine. The taxpayer doesn't have to subsidize you anymore.
No, but Mr. Zidane, it's not so much about money as it is about, the rights of Harvard, about education itself,
Harvard
about
has rights.
their policies for diversity, their policies for hiring, their policies for how much students can protest and they can't. That's their perspective. I'm just asking you your view because I tend to disagree slightly that it's a money issue. I don't think it necessarily is. It's more about what Harvard does now, which perhaps the government of the United States disagrees with.
Vishnu, with due respect, and I understand that you're just making the opposite
Yeah,
point.
yeah,
I understand. Everything is about money. Everything is about money. And the thing that is truly being argued about here, the cudgel that the US government has, is the funding. And again, if you don't want that cudgel to have force, take it away and say, we will subsist without federal funding, and you can do whatever you want. The Trump administration is not by any means sending individuals into classrooms to dictate what professors teach. And when you talk about those hiring practices, I would like to ask anyone who is affiliated with higher education if they are going to go after anti-Semitism with the fervor they used to boost DEI.
Let's, sir.
All right,
Yeah.
Professor Brooks,
Yeah,
just reply quickly to that before I go across to my other panelists. Yeah.
So let's be very clear here. So I am a civil rights lawyer. I prosecuted cases at the United States Justice Department. I led the NAACP, the largest civil rights organization in the country, an organization founded by African Americans and Jews. I take anti-Semitism very, very seriously. The fact of the matter is Harvard has responded to the challenge of anti-Semitism by creating new policies, new programs, new institutions at Harvard. There are a great many people across Harvard and across the country who take anti-Semitism as seriously as any other form of discrimination. But the fact of the matter is you don't get to use anti-Semitism to impose political ideology on a private university. Point one. Point two, when we talk about federal dollars, we need to be very clear that the endowment supports scholarships, the endowment supports research, the endowment supports students of less means to come to Harvard. Point one. And point two, with respect to federal grants, the fact of the matter is Harvard competed for those grants, applied for those grants, was given those grants to do work. So the government doesn't get to, at this point, suspend grants, hold these grants hostage simply based on the whim of a president. We have a First Amendment which says that Harvard students are allowed to speak, faculty are allowed to speak, but more importantly, we're allowed to work, we're allowed to serve, unfettered by a partisan agenda. That's simply not right, not fair, and it does not comport with the conscience of many Americans or the Constitution of all Americans.
Matt Klink, I think a concern which some have raised is if you look at the letter which has been written to Harvard, it sort of reflects the views of President Trump and of this administration. Discontinuation of diversity, DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion, discipline for students who are protesters. Students can't be having masks on their face. These are all priorities of the US government. Who gets to get a job in Harvard and who doesn't? Again, it sort of reflects the demand for transparency, what the Trump administration wants. Do you not see that this is as a fundamental battle between the rights of an institution which seeks to do whatever it wants to do in a way that it's worked for decades versus the government of the United States seeking to impose its political view on an independent educational institution?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on as well. Look, Harvard University has a well-deserved reputation as a top quality academic institution. However, federal money comes with strings attached. And right now, Republicans control the federal government. Period. End of story. And if you're going to take federal money, you need to comply with the terms of taking that money. I will add that going back to what was said earlier, it is all about the money. For example, donations to Harvard University were down $150 million in the last fiscal year, in part because people who are alums and people who contribute to Harvard were so thoroughly disgusted with their out-of-touch liberal policies. So it makes no surprise to me, or it is no surprise to me, that the NAACP and that Barack Obama and other people who benefit from the progressive status quo are going to say Harvard should exercise its free speech and you should just back off. Harvard can do whatever it wants. Harvard can say whatever it wants. But the First Amendment gives you that right, but it doesn't mean that there won't be consequences from it. And Harvard is basically saying, screw you, US taxpayer. We're going to do what we want. We're Harvard University. And you know what? I can see why Donald Trump is doing this. The elitists who run these universities, they are out of touch with mainstream America. Harvard can use its money. They've got billions of dollars. I think 53.2, according to my research, $53.2 billion. They can do whatever they want. Now, I know that folks around the U.S. are saying, thank God somebody finally stood up. It was likely to always be Harvard because they do have that endowment. All that being said, I welcome the opportunity. I mean, this will ultimately be argued in court. And look, I do think that they should look at Harvard's tax-exempt status. And they are an advocacy organization largely for progressive causes. They do not represent the vast majority of Americans, and they are grossly out of touch with the vast majority of Americans. But again, they're Harvard.
Nishacharya, how would you respond to the argument that Harvard is increasingly an advocacy organization out of touch with what Americans say?
I think we know that that's utter nonsense. I think this idea that it's liberal and progressive, I think ask, what is it, 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices who went to Harvard, Senator Ted Cruz, who went to Harvard. I mean, this idea is it's in the sort of spin chamber of Washington, D.C. But the reality is most of this money that Harvard is potentially losing, $2 billion, is actually in research grants that are conducting path-breaking medical research, social science research, energy research. These are drugs and medical devices and products that are developed in the United States, then become job creators in the United States. So just like he did with the tariffs, just like he's done with a lot of the education grants, what we're seeing here is a unorganized, poorly planned effort to punish institutions that are deemed liberal. And what we're going to see is most of this is going to go backwards because, again, why would you give up U.S. leadership in biotech and medical research for no reason whatsoever other than to satisfy a small political base? You're going to lose jobs, you're going to lose revenue, tax, all of that is going to be lost. So I think what Harvard saw was that there's a big downside for the country to complying with these with this idea of making some changes which they don't think they necessarily need to make. Now, whether they need to be more focused on anti-Semitism, that's a fair question. Whether they align with the priorities of the Trump administration, that's fair as well, but not overnight. Certainly nobody does that in the private sector, which Republicans hold up as to be their how they judge things is what the private sector does. And Harvard is a private university. So I think it's going to be important. I think Harvard is going to push back. I think today is the day where we see large institutions, just like the companies did with the tariffs, start to push back on this willy-nilly, disorganized set of punitive demands and tariffs. And then the last thing I want to say on that is if the tax status, the 501c3, that's determined by Congress, not by the president. And if he does take away from Harvard, that opens the door for religious institutions, hospitals, churches, everybody to lose that. And I don't think anybody in America, even the most conservative, want to see that change. So I think this is all, really today's going to be a day when we see this stuff changing back to a more normal progression of political discourse.
Professor Andrew Latham, sitting as I am halfway across the world from you, it just strikes me that there's a conversation taking place and a political battle perhaps taking place in the United States where so many of the arguments have been raised about money. Even if it is an argument over money and federal funding, this is federal funding which is meant to cure diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, focus on artificial intelligence, quantum science. It just seems unreal where I am to think that America is having this battle when the money, wherever it comes from, is going towards sorting out these problems. Isn't that the larger issue we should be looking at?
That is absolutely the larger issue.
Well,
because
I guess in a sense.
Half a second, Professor Andrew Latham.
I'm an immigrant to this country, the United States, and I've been here for a while, but I'm frequently astounded by the so-called debates that take place around higher education. I teach at a liberal arts college, so it's not a research university. We have a different mission, and the mission is twofold. To get students to think through how they should lead their lives and to get students to think through how they should lead their lives together, one's ethics, one's politics. Places like Harvard and Columbia and Princeton, that's part of their mission, but that's not all of it. And when I look at this so-called debate, I don't think either or, I think both and. On the one hand, there is no denying anybody who exists in this ecosystem that I live in can deny that there is something of a monoculture which is progressive and leftist. And it manifests itself in hiring practices and a variety of other practices on campuses. There simply is no way to deny that. That is simply the fact. That's the truth. And so the federal government stepping in and using the leverage it has, because it has all these research dollars, to kind of break that mold, okay, I don't have a problem with that. On the other hand, I do have a problem with taking money away from students on Pell Grants, from other kinds of student support for research that actually advances the human project in terms of health and education and other noble endeavors. So again, it's both and, not either or. And I think framing it as either or and vigorously defending everything that Harvard does or Columbia does or Princeton does or Monoculture does is simply wrong. But also condemning everything that they do is also wrong. And it would be nice if we could find a way to steer between the Scylla and Charybdis of this and to find a way of actually enhancing research, education, and also, though, shattering the monoculture which dominates much of American higher education. Is Trump and his administration capable of that? I don't know. My instinct says I doubt it very much. But sometimes, even people like President Trump, it's like a broken clock.
Okay.
It's right, twice a day.
Last word to you, Alex Zidane. You would have gone through the letter sent to Professor Brooks. I'll come to you as well. But Alex, you've been waiting. There are so many points over here. It just seems very difficult to achieve all of this. Merit-based reform, merit-based hiring reform, viewpoint, diversity in admission and hiring, reforming, etc., etc. Do you realistically expect Harvard to actually achieve this in a short period of time?
Well, no. It's a negotiation like what President Trump engages in all the time. These are up for debate. However, I don't think Harvard actually will. I don't think Harvard will do any of those things in good faith. I think that if you're an independent institution, a truly independent institution for thought and learning, you shouldn't need to do it at the expense or at the whim of the federal government. I think that the value that Harvard does bring, and by the way, the Supreme Court justices who went to Harvard went there decades ago. It's a different climate on college campuses now. It is a monoculture. It is progressive. It is liberal. There is not as much space for countervailing opinions. You are shouted down. The students shout you down. The jeremiad that happens there all the time engages against any student who deviates from the progressive monoculture there. And this is a way for really the president's base, which is overwhelmingly non-college educated working people in this country, to push back against that monoculture, to demand their voices are heard, and to tear down this elitist ivory tower that has been sucking from the American taxpayer for far too long and giving us, the American people, too little in return. My final point to you, Vishnu, is I absolutely agree that there is valuable work being done, but it is not work that can only be done at Harvard. Research, thought, development can be done elsewhere.
Professor Brooks, you've got a minute to respond. I'm sorry I'm being unfair, but that's all the time I have. Go ahead.
3 bites at the apple.
A couple of quick points. Number one, let's be very clear about this. Cancer, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's diseases are not partisan afflictions. They're not Democrat, Republican, or independent, number one. Number two, what the president has asked Harvard to do, it can't do because it is unlawful and unconstitutional to do. And number three, as someone born, raised, and educated in red state America, who graduated from Head Start, who went to a public college, the fact of the matter is I teach students from all across the political spectrum, all across the country, and all around the world. Harvard is an elite institution in resources, but it serves people who come from non-elite backgrounds. Those are the facts. So this is not about politics, it's not about ideology, it's about public service, and it's about the American Constitution and our laws. And the president can't ask us to break the law or violate the Constitution.
So let's see what happens in court. I think that's where it's all headed, and so hopefully there will be an answer soon. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for being with us on a fascinating debate.